Welcome to Chapter 2. This chapter is going to be some review as well from Macro, namely the sections on opportunity cost and uh, the trade and things like that. Human action and things along those lines may be new to you depending on which textbook was actually used in your macroeconomics section. So, the two basic principles of human action. Number one, people's wants and desires are virtually unlimited. No matter what you do in life, no matter how much you store away, there's always going to be something that you desire, something that you want. You need food in order to survive, for instance. So no matter how much food you put away, there's going to be food that spoils and doesn't stick around, and you're always going to be needing to go out and get some more food in your life. And there are other things that fall under that example as well. And then, of course, number two, resources for the fulfillment of those wants and desires are limited and largely unusable in their natural state. So when we pull coal or various natural resources out of the ground, whether it be copper, iron, whatever it may be. Oil is a really good example considering how many things we break that down into and use it in plastics and all the way to using it to powering our cars. So a lot of these resources in their state when they first come out are pretty much unusable. So we need to actually process these resources to make them usable for everybody. And then, of course, those resources are limited. We don't have unlimited resources on this earth. There is only so much oil, there's only so much coal, there's only much gold, there's only so much food, there's only so much time. So, no matter which one we look at, we only have so many of each. Now, given some of these resources in our current state are nowhere near being depleted, and then there's a whole bunch of resources that are actually renewable as well, but we actually have to keep up on a lot of those different things. But time's always an interesting one to talk about because no matter you only have so much time in your life, you don't get to gain time back, and we actually don't know when that time will be up either. So time is a very valuable resource to us. Economic needs are the actual basics. So goods and services everyone demands to survive. So an economic need is going to be food, clothing, basic shelter, things like this. So things you actually need to survive and get by. While economic wants are going to be those things that you desire but you don't really need. As much as I'd like to say I need a car, I don't actually need a car specifically to survive. I don't need a big house, and I don't need a cell phone. So a lot of those things are going to fall under wants. So when we talk about economic needs versus economic wants, economic needs are those very basic things you need to get by in life. I know a car may fall under what you would think would be an economic need, but there's other ways to get to your job or get to the places that you need to be, whether there be bus services, bikes, rollerblades, motorized bikes, all sorts of different ways to get around. And if you didn't have a vehicle, you would change the way you handle things as well. You may try to choose the location you live much closer to where your job is, for instance. Now, the government tends to step in and likes to decide what's a want and what's a need. And as of recently here in Michigan, at least in the past few years, cell phones have started to fall under economic needs in the government's view, that is. But when we are actually looking at it from an economic view, so if you're asked on a test, is a cell phone a economic need? The answer would be a flat no, of course. You don't need a cell phone to survive, even though there may be some of you that think that's the case. Like I know if you go without a cell phone for a day, you almost feel like there's a part of you missing. It really stinks when you you forget your phone. You're just like, whoa. But in reality, it's just, we got used to it. We really like it. It's a huge convenience, but it's not a need. It's a want. Resources include things like land and natural resources, supplies, working capital, equipment, tools, machinery, which are your fixed capital goods, money, of course, labor, entrepreneurship, and time. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the majority of those. Every productive activity involves the use of some of those above resources in one way or another, and are to create goods and services to fulfill those wants and needs that we were just talking about. And it's kind of interesting that over the years that every time one group of scientists warns of the imminent depletion of an unrenewable commodity, another group of scientists discovers a new source for that commodity or a substitute for it nonetheless. So resources are still limited. And as we said before, resources have to be changed in order to make them usable. But going back to that little statement there that our book talks about, where it seems that every time one group of scientists warns of imminent depletion, all of a sudden something else comes up. A great example of that actually in action, to some extent, was back in the days when gasoline got up over $4 a gallon. So it got really, really expensive. And people started to change their actions and they started to demand alternative fuels. And in fact, here in Michigan, as you were driving down the streets, every other car that was on the side of the road that was for sale was a pickup truck or some sort of vehicle that used a lot of gasoline. People were really, really demanding fuel economy at the time, which makes sense because of how expensive gasoline got for that little bit. But then new developments happened throughout the economy. We started getting this new way of doing fracking, and things started to really change again. And all of a sudden, when we were approaching a situation where gasoline was becoming a bit more scarce, reflected in our prices, everything changed. And it wasn't just because we started demanding those alternative fuels either. Now, if gas prices had stayed up high, there's no doubt in my mind we would have moved further into some different alternative fuels. But that's just how it works. So every time we start getting to a point where it seems like a particular resource is getting depleted in the way that we get it at that time period, we are going to come up with different alternatives on how to deal with that. So we're either going to come up with a substitute, which in the case of gasoline would be an alternative fuel, or we're going to become more efficient at using said fuel so we don't use that fuel up as fast. And it doesn't have to necessarily be fuel, it could be any type of commodity or product that we're talking about. And then, of course, there's the fact that when the price of a particular commodity goes up, the incentive to find new sources of it and new ways to get sources of it increases greatly. So you have all that extra incentive to go out and find new deposits of oil, or if we're talking about gold, new deposits of gold. If we start talking about wood, new ways of getting wood, new ways to make sure that our forests do not deplete so that we're always planting and replacing trees as we put them down. Now, this particular subject we're actually going to hit in even greater detail later in the semester. Now, keep in mind, when we're talking about goods and services, there's actually a cost of distribution. So when we take the coal or iron or copper out of the ground, it's usually not where the consumer or not where the factory that's going to process said natural resource is. So we're going to have to move those goods around. But it's not just goods that need to be moved around either. People also need to move around. For instance, Jungnan University, because they want me to teach for them, they're actually going to have to fly me over to China. If they had left all that cost in my hands, that could have changed whether I wanted to go over there or not, because it would have chipped greatly away at the benefits of teaching over there, because it would come out of my salary, for instance. And then, of course, information. has to move. And this was a huge deal in the past, because in the past, in order to get information, you had to send it on a ship from Europe to the United States, for instance, or send it on a ship to Asia, or by horse to Asia. But now we have the internet where we can send information at the blink of an eye to those various individuals throughout the entire world. Now, processes also create pollution or create waste. So these are what we call externalities. So costs that are going to come out and affect usually a third party as well as ourselves. Now, it is impossible at the moment to completely remove byproducts. So when we process various raw materials, there's going to be some sort of byproduct from doing that. When you cut wood, for instance, you get sawdust. That's a byproduct. And if you're burning coal in order to power the blades that are going, we have CO2 and soot and all sorts of stuff that you're probably allowing to billow into the air. Now, if we're able to find more efficient processes or actually find uses for those byproducts, we can change the game a little bit. We can lower the effect that there's going to be on the environment, and then of course it's going to make things even better for the company, because if you're becoming more efficient, that's more cost effective. And then when you're finding use for products here, byproducts that is, you're finding ways to create products out of what used to be waste, or maybe you're finding a way to create fuel out of some of those byproducts. There's lots of different ways you can use those byproducts instead of just throwing them into a landfill, and your company can benefit a great deal by doing so. If you've worked retail before, I'm sure you've noticed that a lot of companies will bale cardboard. So they'll take all of the cardboard and they'll put it into a bale, and usually they end up selling that cardboard. At Kohl's, anyway, they always put, they even had signs up front about how green they were. And really, when you go and you look at all the different green things that Kohl's did, they were all profit driven. So, yes, they help the environment. So recycling the cardboard helps the environment, but it also lines their pockets a bit. And the other thing that they like to talk about is that their buildings were energy efficient, that they'd put in high efficiency air conditioners, that they use LED and fluorescent lighting, and they put the lighting on timers, and they have all these different ways of saving electricity on their computers and other processes. And that's all saving them money on electricity, as well as lowering their waste. And then, of course, when you start talking about factories and warehouses, you have the situation of like aluminum. Aluminum is huge, and if you recycle aluminum, there's a significant amount of money behind recycling that aluminum. So next up, we have time and depreciation. The big key thing to remember here is time cannot be banked. Don't miss this one on the midterm. Every year I get a few people that think that time can be banked, but how can you save time for a later time? Once your time of the day has passed, you can't pull 2 hours out of your pocket from part of the day that you tried to save. There's different things you can do to lower the amount of time you're using on a particular process by becoming more efficient, but that's still not banking time for later. Now, we also have this concept called depreciation. So machines and housing and clothing, they're going to break down over time. They're going to need upkeep to keep them going. And then, of course, as time goes on, a lot of these different things are going to lose value. Now, there's some situations we can talk about where in value, a value could actually increase over time for a particular thing. Like in this particular case, housing could actually see an increase depending on what supply and demand is in the particular market you are with that house. But the actual condition of the house, unless you are upkeeping it, with the income condition depreciating, that's kind of a downward pressure on the value. And you just might be getting lucky if the value of the house is going up in your particular market because lots of people are moving in or very few people are moving out. There's lots of different reasons for it. Now, there's also what we call accounting depreciation, but remember that accounting depreciation is just a way of breaking up the costs in the books. If we get in, well, later on in the semester, we are going to get into dealing with economic costs. And in economic costs, we actually don't really talk about depreciation because accounting depreciation, that is, because we account for that cost now. So if you built a $300,000 building for your business, we are going to count that $300,000 now. And we're going to count it in that year. And if you remember when we were calculating gross domestic product, it's that same thing. So in gross domestic product, we count that 300,000 in its totality now. Now, every successful business does put aside a certain amount of money to cover the cost of depreciation. In a way, we could argue that it's that accounting depreciation in action again. Time is a critical element in all economic decision making. So, how much time are we actually going to need to do a specific activity? How much time is available for doing the activity? How many people will be involved in the activity in order to get that activity actually done? Uh, must the activity be created in a certain time frame? So, did we get an emergency order? And then, of course, what is the cost for that time, whether it be the opportunity cost or the literal labor cost when we're making a decision on what to do with all of that time. The universal economic problem is the need to balance limited resources. We don't have unlimited resources with the fact that wants are unlimited and they're always going to be there. We're always going to need food. We're always going to need water, clothing, and shelter and things like that. So we have this situation where we only have so much, but yet we all have unlimited wants. There's all these different things that we want and need in life. Now, competition is the inevitable result of society facing that insatiable demand versus the limited supply. All society must choose among a limited number of resources in order to achieve certain goals. So we're going to decide, and the price system really helps us with that, on what goods and services in society should be made with the limited resources we have, whether they be the natural resources or the limited amount of time that we have. Now, the market is not just a competitive process, though, it is also a cooperative process. Cooperative relationships are key to our survival, basically. We can't get by without cooperating with one another. Without a certain amount of cooperation, the productive processes would actually cease. So, for instance, if one party, say landlords, decided that they were going to hold on to all their land, they were no longer going to lease, sell, rent, whatever you want to do, and that would literally prevent any new business, it would prevent any new house building unless those landlords themselves went out and did that. But something tells me if all the landlords stopped dealing with other people, they may start running into these similar situations from other groups in society. Now, another way you can look at cooperation is between you and your employer. Your employer pays you in order to provide your labor to them. That's a trade. That's cooperation between you two. And if the employer isn't able to find anyone to give them their labor, odds are they're not going to do what they need to get done. They're just going to end up having to shut down. Now, because of inequality and limited resources, inequality being when we talk about different skill levels in society, human beings are seldom completely self sufficient. They need the help and expertise of others. So, I may be really good at fixing computers. I may be really good in economics and business consulting, etc. However, I am terrible when it comes to fixing cars. There's some very basic things I can do. I can change a tire, I can change a battery, I can put fluids in there, etc. But if something else goes wrong, whether I blow a thermostat or I need a new radiator, uh, I'm going to have to go to somebody that has the skills in that particular field to get the work done. And we all specialize in various things and skills that we are good at. Um, of course, we try to balance it with skills that we also enjoy doing, because that's kind of like the dream, right? You want to be able to both be good at what you're doing and enjoy what you are doing. And that will actually bring a lot of value to you in life. So, if, for instance, there are going to be some situations where, say, you have a skill that you're really good at, but the skill that you really like doing, you're not as good at. And it's kind of an interesting thing to look at because you may be willing to take on that skill you're not as good at because you enjoy doing it so much at a much lower pay just because, well, you enjoy doing it so much. So when you're choosing a job, we also consider the fact that you are going to place value on specific jobs over other jobs on top of that. And that starts getting to the where you can explain situations where you see people with high levels of training in one specific field and then they're not in that field, or master's degrees in that particular field and they're at a restaurant flipping burgers by choice. Whether they opened that restaurant, odds are they opened the restaurant, but they decided to do that because they enjoyed it. That's what they wanted to do. But anyways, back to the point, we have limited resources and we're all going to have to choose usually to specialize in something so that we can make our living, which by specializing in those specific things that allows other people to specialize in completely different things, and then we just trade amongst each other to get to the point where we fulfill our needs and wants. Now this is definitely some review from macro, but it's really important in micro as well. Opportunity costs, the value of the next best alternative or foregone activity. Now that is the definition that we use in economics, but we could actually look at opportunity costs as literally everything you are giving up, as well as what you could have done instead. So when you go out and you're going to buy something, yes, you have the opportunity cost of the money and the time it took to go out and buy that, but you could have used your time and money to do something completely different. And when we start looking at something as large as like a vacation, then we're looking at, well, you're giving up the time for work, you're giving up all the money that you are using to go on said vacation, and of course your time itself. So, but because there's so many things that we would have to keep track of when it comes to opportunity costs like that, we tend to just break it down to what the next best alternative, the next best two alternatives or foregone activity, just to make it simpler to attract. And opportunity costs apply to both business and personal decisions, so it's not just one or the other. Now, I was just talking about specialization on the last slide, and specialization is when you spend all of your time producing a particular good or service. So that's what you are best at doing, or what we've already talked about in the other examples. So you choose to do that, and by doing so, you earn your living, and then you're able to trade with others who are specializing in order to make it in life. Now, comparative advantage is economic gain occurs when the items produced or services that are provided are being most efficiently produced or provided, made at the lowest cost slash opportunity cost. So if you have comparative advantage in something, you may not be able to produce the most of it. If you're producing the most of something, you have absolute advantage. Completely different. Comparative advantage just says that you can do it at the lowest cost. So maybe you have a particular what's good? A furniture company. We'll talk about a furniture company. And you are able to only produce 2,000 chairs in a year, but you can produce those 2,000 chairs at the lowest cost out of everyone at that specific grade and quality, while your competitors can produce say 5 to 6 times as much as you, but not at the lower cost. And you can see that even though you're producing a lower amount of it, you definitely have an advantage over that competitor. Comparative advantage shows us that a trade is beneficial to everyone involved in it, in the case where one may have absolute advantage in the majority of the goods being traded. So there's lots of situations we can go throughout the world and look at where individuals within, say, the United States may have absolute advantage over all of the companies in, say, Spain for various different things. But yet there's going to be a bunch of companies within Spain that have comparative advantage over the American companies over here. And because that situation exists, even though we may have absolute advantage, all our companies may have absolute advantage over here, but we can't do it at the lowest cost, so it makes sense for us to trade. And if we were to draw that good old production possibilities frontier, if you remember back to what that is, it's just a line that shows us all the different uses for a particular couple of resources for a company. So without trade, that company can only be on the line or beneath it. And if they're beneath it, they're running inefficiently, by the way. Anything above it is unattainable without trade. But as soon as you reach a situation where you have trade and you bring trade into it, all of a sudden you're above that line. You gain access to more resources, more products and services than you would have been able to do without trade. So let's go through a little mental exercise here. So let's suppose you have 2 working lawnmowers and your neighbor has 2 working snowblowers. The snowblowers and lawnmowers are of similar value, and you and your neighbor want to trade. So these snowblowers and lawnmowers are at the exact same working order. They're both the exact same value. Your neighbor needs the opposite item than you need, so the person that has the snowblowers is in need of a lawnmower. The person with the lawnmowers is in need of the snowblowers. Is there anything wrong with this trade if they decide to make this trade? The answer is no. The trade is economically better for both of you. You will both be better off. You'll gain something that you didn't have before while getting rid of something that you had of in surplus to do so. So you both end up being better off and having a good that you did not have before. So you're both happy. So now let's suppose you own a business making laptops, and your friend owns a business that makes components for laptops, so the parts that make up the laptop. Your friend makes components that exceed your needs but can be offered to you at a price competitors charge for lower quality components. So your friend's coming to you and saying, well, if you order from me, I will give you a great deal. My components are better than my competitors, but yet I'm a bit lower cost than them. So both you and your friend will make greater profits through the trade. So in this case, we're just talking about money. So you're going to buy the components from your friend. Your friend's going to make a profit off a said trade, and then you're going to turn around, put those into the laptop, and then the laptop's going to be sold to the end user, consumers. Is there anything wrong economically with this trade? The answer is still no. Both parties stand to gain from the trade, just like the previous example. Trading actually makes perfect sense in this case. So you're going to end up with those better components, which is going to give you an edge over your competitors when you go to sell those laptops. And then, of course, your friend is probably going to be able to leverage greater economies of scale, which is going to lower his expenses. And, of course, he's going to make a profit off of the sale of components to you. So now let's go and change things up a bit more, but we're going to stick with that same example of your friend making components and you making laptops. But now let's suppose you live in the United States and you make your laptops in the United States and your friend makes those components and lives in China. You want to trade just like before, and nothing about the transaction itself has changed. It is still very profitable for the both of you. So the only thing that's changed now is we've drawn some invisible lines between individuals, because it's still people, the same, we're all human beings. The people in China, people here in the United States, the only thing that's changing is the jurisdiction, the rules that we live in. We're still humans, and we still all benefit from trade. So is there anything wrong with this trade? And the answer, of course, is still no. This trade is economically beneficial to everyone involved, including those who will eventually purchase the laptops, because the laptops are going to be of a higher grade and quality as well. Nothing changes just because there is an invisible border. So the trade is still beneficial to all the individuals that are included in this trade. They wouldn't do the trade if it was going to harm them. These, you got to remember, this is all voluntary trade. They chose to make those trades. Then, of course, trade allows individuals between countries. So if we were to add up the economies of a country, so the United States and China in this case, because the United States and China trade with one another, we both gain access to more goods and services. So we're above that line on the production possibilities frontier. Now, it's really interesting. If you remember back, I on the beginning of the first lecture, I talked a little bit about different schools of thought. And those different schools of thought tend to disagree on specific things. For instance, the Austrian school of thought would say that what the Keynesian school of thought says may be wrong, and vice versa. But they agree on this point, that trade is beneficial and helps the economy grow. And we can go right down the line between the various schools of thought and see that they all agree on that. There's very, very few things that we can actually step back and go, well, everyone in economics basically agrees on this. And this is one of those points they actually all agree on, that trade is beneficial to all those involved, as long as it's voluntary. So as long as we don't have a government in there forcing the hand by gunpoint, that trade is going to be beneficial to everyone involved. Now, another interesting point to consider too is when economics was invented. So when the science actually came about, its entire point was to prove this, that trade was beneficial and that we needed free and open trade between countries because all of us would end up being better off from it. So why then is trade demonized by so many if the evidence all points to trade being beneficial? And the science of economics was literally born from this argument. So yeah, even if we go and look at the evidence over the years, So NAFTA is a really good one to look at because obviously there's in the news today we start seeing people attacking NAFTA, saying that it's been harmful overall versus good. Back when NAFTA was actually being decided on whether we should do it or not, it was being demonized back then as well. But in the end, it actually created way, like significantly more, multiples. So go to the nth power, more jobs created than jobs that were lost because of NAFTA. And then, of course, the significant raise in the standard of living that happened in all of North America from the lowering of costs for goods and services. The economic benefits of NAFTA were just enormous, and the data all points to that. So why then, if we have all this data, we have an entire science that was invented actually just to argue this point, is trade still demonized? And the answer is very visible harm versus invisible benefits in many ways. So let's talk about the steel industry, because the steel industry has been a protected industry for hundreds of years now. So if you think that we need temporary protection for a particular industry, yeah, it doesn't work that way. Once you start protecting industry, it needs to be protected for the rest of its life, basically. They become dependent on that. Tariffs are a form of corporate welfare, believe it or not, because you're protecting them from competition and allowing them to charge higher prices. So anyway, back to those very visible harms. So if we were to suddenly say remove the steel tariff, and I'm just talking about the steel tariff pre-Trump. So we had a tariff before he even came in. So if you remove that steel tariff, there's no doubt there's going to be loss of jobs. So let's say we have 10,000 jobs that end up being lost because some larger steel companies end up going out of business because they can't compete with steel coming out of basically everywhere in the world. Most countries throughout the world can produce steel better than we can. And now let's say, so you have 10,000 jobs being lost, and we'll do a nice high average so this is easier to see, and we'll say that the average pay was 50,000. So if we take 50,000 times 10,000, oh, let me write that down really quick. So we end up at like 500 million dollars that just basically vanishes from the economy as far as salaries go. So those people that lost their jobs go through a really rough period. I've been through unemployment. It's not a fun thing to go through. It's a situation where, you feel like you're almost useless. When I went into it, I had been working 3 jobs for the majority of my life, and then I finally get a full-time job for a year, and they end up laying me off. So all my life I'd been extremely busy, and then I find myself in this situation where I'm not making an income. I had just been married as well. I mean, literally 2 weeks before I was laid off, my wife and I got married. So, needless to say, it's this huge stressor. This here's down. Your confidence goes down, way down. And, there's all that talk about people that go into depression. And it was definitely one of the hardest, excuse me, hardest parts of my life. But, anyway, that is extremely visible. So the people that end up getting laid off really feel it. And that's what's going to end up in the news. So losing your job is very visible harm from that, while the benefits are extremely invisible. And you don't see anyone coming on the news and talk about the millions of jobs that NAFTA has created, really. Even back when they were trying to argue for it, they didn't make all these big arguments about all the job creation process, but that actually does happen. The more you free up trade, the more jobs you're actually going to create in this country as well as other countries. And then, of course, there's the huge benefit of lowering prices through the economy. And that's not just for businesses that see the huge benefit of lower prices, that's you and I as well. We all benefit from those lower prices. I mean, how many of you woke up on Christmas morning as a kid and went down to the Christmas tree and went, gee, if it wasn't for world trade and free trade, I wouldn't have half of what I have today. I wouldn't have had half the gifts. I wouldn't have as big of a house. I wouldn't be able to afford as much food. And it goes well beyond that, and the percentage is actually bigger than half. I used to have these individuals that come up to me when I worked retail, and they tell me, well, it's too bad everything wasn't created here in the United States. And then I'd always tell them, I was like, oh, well, I mean, sure, that sounds nice in detail, but you wouldn't have a quarter of what you have today if that was the case. And on top of that, the quality would be way lower. And the reason why the quality would be way lower is this. So if you protect an industry, so you put a tariff in, it allows them to increase their prices without offering you a better good or service. So they just up the price and you get stuck with it because that tariff's in there coming in there and protecting them from the foreign competition. There's a really good example of that. It's actually Hindustan Motors out of India. So India was extremely protective of their industry back basically from the end of World War II all the way up to about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they realized they were doing things incorrectly, so they needed to make changes, and free trade was one of the big things that they started taking on. Well, anyway, during that time period, there was a car company called Hindustan Motors that started up, and they only made 10,000 cars when they first started. So 20 years later, we go back and we see Hindustan Motors still being protected, and the tariff's been raised on motor vehicles and all that kind of stuff so that they can continue to do business, and they're still only producing 10,000 cars, and they're still producing them to the exact same specs as 20 years ago, the same motor as 20 years ago, the same parts, the same look as 20 years ago. The only difference is you're paying a lot more for it now. That's the kind of situation that you create with protectionism and tariffs, whether it be quotas or whatever other way you come in to try to block trade. You end up creating huge inefficiencies in your economy, and then we as consumers end up getting stuck with shoddy goods and services at a higher price. So, yes, even though I've been through that situation of the layoff, I am sitting here arguing and telling you that the benefits of open trade way outweigh any cost that comes from allowing that trade. The invisible benefits are enormous for our economy. All right, so stepping back into where we left off in the chapter, entrepreneurs are the business owners and producers who assume the risk and uncertainty and responsibility of running an enterprise. So they go out and actually seek out the needs and wants of consumers. And they do it through innovation, technology changes, increase in capital expenditures. And you can be an entrepreneur in multiple different ways. It doesn't have to actually be through creating innovative products or services or filling a specific niche market like what you're used to. You may just be better at organizing business and becoming more efficient business runner than others that are currently in the industry. And that would allow you to lower the costs and compete with your competitors, even with the same good or service, just because you can produce it at such a lower cost. Now, without these decision makers, economic performance and living standards would not be advanced. Now, keep in mind that entrepreneurs are also speculators. Speculators are often viewed in such a negative light because they get blamed for crisis, chaos. They get if the stock market crashes, well, they're going to probably get blamed for the stock. It's going to be like, well, the speculators jumped the price too high. Never mind the incentives that they're being provided through the government. It's always the speculators' fault. But the speculators are often the only ones willing to assume the risk of volatile price changes that affect things like farmers or importers, exporters, and other hedgers in the marketplace. There's a lot of situations where farmers would actually be in a really rough situation if the speculators weren't able and willing to come in there and buy up those commodities and then go trade them throughout the world. There would be a ton of unsold farming goods and services. Now, moving back to human action. Human action is purposeful behavior aimed at substituting a more satisfactory condition for a less satisfactory affair. So we are trying to make our situation better. We're all trying to get to that situation where we are in a better situation, right? So we assume in economics that you are behaving in a way that is going to make you better off with given information. And this is the key. So there's a lot of different schools of thought that come back at the ones that talk about human action like this and say, well, there's going to be people that make bad decisions, and those bad decisions are in their best interest. But the reality is, if they had different information at that period when they made that bad decision, odds are they would have made a different decision. Now, there's some really goofy ones we talk about where people start who end up getting hurt. So, say you sit there. Well, we can actually use alcohol as a really good example here, the whole hold my beer thing, right? So, say you've drank a lot of beer, and because you drank a lot of beer at the time, you're thinking, well, this is going to be fun, it tastes great. You had no idea that you were going to go and make that poor decision later that's been influenced by alcohol, that you pull that stunt and hurt yourself, whatever it may be. So, if you had had the information beforehand, odds are you wouldn't have done that. If you knew, well, today if I do this, I'm going to go out and break my leg. No, you're not going to go, oh, man, well, breaking my leg's fine. That's all fine and dandy. Let's go break my leg. No. It's just like when, if you're running a business and you decide to get into a specific line of product, and then you don't sell it. If you had more information about that market beforehand and you knew it wasn't going to sell, you would have never got the product in the first place. So you make a decision with a certain amount of information. Nobody has perfect knowledge. Nobody knows everything that is going to happen in a marketplace. So you make the best decision that you can that's going to help your situation. So, to accomplish our goals, we think, feel, learn, value, and act. So, we learn from the mistakes we make in life. We place value on various things through various things that we learn throughout life, and so on. And behind every price are buying and selling decisions of numerous people. This is the economic process that's actually in action. So, all of the people that are buying and selling in products and services, all of their knowledge technically gets added up to create that price that you are seeing. And because all that knowledge gets added up to create that price you're seeing, all you need to know as an individual is what is that price. So let's break it down to a little easier example. Say you like potato chips and you wanted to buy a bag of potato chips. All you are going to need to know in order to be able to buy that bag of potato chips is whether you like them or not, what the price is, and whether you are willing to deal with the opportunity costs of buying those potato chips. So are you willing to give up the dollar or whatever they cost? So you don't need to know all the process that went into making those potato chips. You don't need to know that there was a potato shortage in part of Idaho or whatever. You don't need to know. You just see the price, and if the price is what you want to pay, you're going to buy it. So even though all of these different things led to that price, you don't need to know all those different things. Now, human action is never random, even though it may appear so to observers. So when you start adding up all of human action, so we start looking at society, for instance, it looks as if some things are just moving completely in random. But in reality, what's happening is all of these individual decisions have just been added up to reach that point. And you don't know what decisions your neighbor's going to make, for instance. Your neighbor doesn't know what you're going to make or their neighbors, and so on. So we all make decisions with the given information we have that we think is going to better our situation, that we're going to enjoy ourselves doing whatever we're doing, and that all adds up to the situation that almost seems as if it is random, but actually it's a bunch of decisions being made by individuals. Purposeful human action is distinct, and it is actually distinct from the actions of plants and animals and mechanical things. It's one of the things that actually separates us apart from them. Now, physicists and chemists can do regular and repeatable patterns in physical events. They can see it, they can do the scientific method and repeat them. So, using the scientific method, they can repeatedly perform a controlled experiment and expect the same results are consistent. It's one of the great things about the normal sciences like chemistry and physics and whatnot. They can perform the same experiment as long as they have the exact same environment and whatnot, and they're going to get the exact same results. But that's not true in economics and other sciences that study human behavior, because humans are not machines or lemmings destined to repeat themselves exactly time after time or respond the same way to stimuli. So when you go through an event from a life, you're going to learn from that event, and you're going to try to do what you encounter next time. Maybe it's a similar event. You're going to try to create a better outcome. You learn from it, so you're going to try to end up doing something better. And because of that, you're going to end up with different situations. And then you take into the fact that no two humans are the same. So one human, when given one situation, could end up giving a completely different answer and different way of attacking something than the other human being, because they grew up in different situations. They learned different things. They've read different books. They've been exposed to different events throughout their entire life. So they're going to think differently. They're going to attack problems differently. So you're going to end up with different results. Human beings possess the ability to think, learn, and change their minds. The difference between man and nature is often referred to methodological dualism. It's that difference between us. On a side note, economics and human behavior has shown time and time again that a mathematical variable cannot be assigned to human action. So, with today's technology, so this could change 30, 40 years from now, but as of now and for all of history, we have not been able to assign a mathematical variable to all of human action. It is literally impossible at this point. We've tried time and time and again. We've had lots and lots of massive formulas to try to predict human action and the economy, and it just has not worked out. One of the big examples of recent history, of course, is the Black-Scholes formula. In the Black-Scholes formula, they thought they had eliminated all risk. They literally thought they had done it. They won the Nobel Prize for economics for it as well. So not only did they think they had got it, everyone else thought they had got it as well. This formula is so advanced, it had rocket science and stuff into it. So after they won the Nobel Prizes and they thought they had really done it, they thought they had the perfect formula, they decided to test it in the marketplace. They assembled what was called the Dream Team of the best investors, the best economists and whatnot in the marketplace. So the best stock traders, and of course the individual that came up with the Black-Scholes formula. And they created a company to invest using this particular formula. And for the first few months, holy cow, did they make a lot of money. They were making well above average returns in the marketplace, and they thought everything was good. But one change in the world set the entire thing on fire. Russia defaulted on their debt. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. So Russia defaulting on their debt sets so many things in motions that this company, who has the perfect formula that predicts everything in the marketplace, fails. So in a very short amount of period, a very short amount of time, that is, after Russia defaults on their debt, they lose $1 trillion, the largest and fastest loss in history at the time. And they need a bailout from us because they're intertwined in so many different things throughout the marketplace. Now, hopefully, near the end of the semester, we'll have a bit more time to spend on benefits versus costs of bailouts. So I'll let you make that decision for now. But yeah, we end up bailing out these more or less gamblers in this situation. And they put the money in, so they be the ones that end up losing the money. But we'll talk about that later. A strict application of the scientific method might not always work in economics, even though it is part of the modern economic toolbox. There are some economists that actually do try to use the scientific method in mainstream economics, the very mathematical side of economics. And they use it to some success. Uh, it's they off I've tried it personally as well, and I've even tried to repeat some of the economic experiments that were set forth by some of the individuals before me, and I tend to get some different results, as do other people. It's just because you start looking at economic experiments, and you're going to be dealing with human action, and of course, human action you can't put a variable to, and you can't really control it, so you're going to end up with different results. So how do we test economic theory then? Well, we test it with facts. The best economists can do is test their theories against historical data, events, and even then the outcome is uncertain since there are many, many variables out there. So we come up with a theory, and then that theory is going to have certain set points that have to stay the same through that whole theory. So, for instance, when we look at the law of demand states that with all else equal, if prices increase, quantity demanded will go down. And that all else equal part is the part I'm talking about, because this is the control in a way in the experiment. So if something changes other than price, the law of demand doesn't work because you're not staying within its set things. So you need to have all else equal in order to see the law of demand in action. And the reason why all else has to stay equal is, say you're looking at Coca-Cola and you change the price, but at the same time that you change the price, everyone's taste changed, and all of a sudden people don't like Coca-Cola. You could lower the price, and lowering the price under the law of demand would normally tell you that people would buy more Coca-Cola. But if everyone decided that they like Pepsi, you may not sell any Coca-Cola. So that's what I mean. So you have something change outside of those set circumstances that we come up with for that theory, and then you fall outside of that theory. You're no longer within the set constraints of that particular theory. Now, if we have a theory where we come up with these rules and the outcome isn't what is supposed to happen. So, say in the law of demand, nothing else changes, and we lower the price by a good amount, and the quantity actually decreases with the decrease of price, and nothing else changed in the market. Obviously, in reality, something else would have had to change in the market for it to happen, but we're just saying that for this situation. If that happened, then the law of demand should be rejected. We reject the law of demand because the law of demand no longer works in all instances. And that's the same with any economic theory. So if we run into a situation with where our assumptions, so our assumptions are those things that I was talking about. So if our assumptions are all there and it doesn't yield the result it is supposed to do, we reject that theory and we move on and we try to come up with something better. Economics is not a set science just like any other science out there. So when we find better ways of doing things, we should move on to those better ways of doing things. So that means, technically speaking, a whole bunch of things from the school of thought that I am learning from in my PhD a week from now could be proven wrong. And that's a good thing, because we just weeded out those bad theories then. And then it's time to go out and come out with those better theories that we can use to make all of our situations better, and that we can use to understand things even better. Anyway, moving on. Humans make mistakes. Before an action is taken, it is assumed that the decision will be positive, but it may be a mistake. Decisions are made with all the information known at the point of the decision. So we've already talked about that there. The world economy is characterized by frequent individual and business failures. So business failure, individual failure is a part of life. You're going to make decisions that are not the best decisions throughout your entire life, and you're going to learn from those and move on, and hopefully you figure out ways to prevent those things from going on. And the same goes for business, because if they continue to make those failures, the business will go out. Can economists predict the future? Well, economists have predicted 6 of the last 5 recessions. Yeah. No, they cannot easily predict the future. And if you have an economist that is sitting there bragging that they can sit there and predict every part of the future just like that, they are lying. They cannot. There are way too many variables out there to be able to predict exactly what's going to happen. So all we can do is make our absolute best guess with our given information. The principle of causality. So for every cause, there is an effect. Behind every economic event, there are causes that brought it on. So when we have an economic event happen, there's got to be a bunch of things that actually caused that. So what things incentivized human behavior to hit that point? That's one thing we can go back and look at. So when we go back and we look at the housing crisis, we see, for instance, a law that says a certain percentage of minorities need to qualify for housing loans by law, no matter how many people apply for them. So this created an incentive for banks, but at gunpoint, may I say, because obviously you're going to end up basically getting fines or in all sorts of trouble if you don't do this, and it led to giving loans out to people that didn't have credit ratings and collateral to pay for them. I mean, to support that. So they couldn't normally qualify for said loan, but yet they were being given those loans because the banks were being forced to. Another incentive we can talk about which led to the housing crisis, is the fact that the Federal Reserve allowed for fractional reserve banking that would have never been possible without it. And then, of course, we have the artificially lower interest rates. And then we can go and we look at the mortgage-backed security incentives that were created by the fact that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were constantly insuring all of these different loans, making it seem as if there was risk. It made it seem as if the government would step right in there and cover any of these losses. Remember, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are government institutions. So you can go back and you can see, it's like, well, all of these crazy incentives were created. So of course you end up with this outcome because people followed those incentives. So anyway, back to the principle of uncertainty. The future of human action is always uncertain. We can't predict the future, so we don't know the way people are going to react. And then we like to hope that people learn from all their past mistakes so that when the same things come forward in the future, they don't make the exact same mistake again. Now, when we start looking at mathematics again here in economics, statistical analysis, for instance. So, statistical analysis always has a margin of error. So, there's going to be a thing that says plus or minus 5%, or plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 3%, almost after all the statistics that you look at. And that says that, say we have a statistic that says 10%, and you have a plus or minus 5%. So that means the real statistics could be anywhere between 5 and 15%. And in that case, that's a really big margin. Obviously, you can get into situations where the margin of error is a bit smaller, and that's when we start talking about spending more and more to create a bigger sample to lower that. But regardless, always keep in mind that statistical analysis has that margin of error there, and they can also be incorrect about that level of margin of error. The margin of error in reality could end up being bigger because they're making their best informed guess. Computer programs and mathematical formulas are based on historical patterns, and patterns often break down. So that's your Black-Scholes formula right in action there, right? So we made this huge mathematical formula based on what we knew. Something that we didn't expect happened, came out, and there's always going to be something we don't expect. That's part of life. It's going to cause those patterns to break down, and thus those mathematical formulas and computer programs are going to start spitting out the incorrect answer. Keynes once said our knowledge of the future is fluctuating, vague, and uncertain. There is no scientific basis in which to form any calculable probability whatever. We simply do not know. So Keynes himself, who you could argue was a supporter of econometrics and these formulas, even admitted that this is the world we live in. It's uncertainty, and you're not going to be able to get rid of that uncertainty. So uncertainty exists for two reasons. There's a vast complex number of factors and players involved in the economy. So there's a ton of people, and they're all doing different things. And then the fact that behind the numbers are individuals who are constantly changing and reevaluating their motives. People are learning, they're switching up what they're doing because of what they've gone through. And then finally, one of the big tripping points, and one of the things that we're constantly battling, not only in the world of economics, but out in the statistical world now, correlation does not equal causation. So a correlation is a statistical relationship between two variables. So when one variable goes up, the other variable goes up. Or when one variable goes down, the other one goes down. Or when one variable goes up, the other one goes down. That one's called an inverse correlation. And we often point to these correlations as the actual cause. And that's an issue because they're not always the cause. In fact, many times it's not the cause. There just happens to be a statistical relationship between them. It doesn't mean it's actually causing the other thing to happen. I'll give you an example, and this is actually one of the famous ones. There is a strong correlation between ice cream sales and theft. Using this data, we could make the blanket statement, the more ice cream sales means more theft. So therefore, we should ban ice cream because it would eliminate theft. And right there you can see how silly that is. But that's what we do in the world of economics right now when we use correlation as our reason. We're basically just going, well, the one goes up, the other one goes up, let's ban the other, and the other one will stop, right? No, that's not how it works. If you ban ice cream, crime isn't going to stop. Now, there's some pretty crazy correlations that you can go out there and find. You can just do a little bit of Googling and find them. There's a correlation between becoming entangled in your bed sheets and dying, and then the number of movies that Nicolas Cage has started. And then there's the same type of thing being correlated with Venezuelan oil sales. There's no relationship between the two, but yet the correlation still does not exist. They're not causing one another. So correlation does not equal causation. Don't get tripped up on that. All right, so moving on to Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 is a pretty short one, and it's actually a bit of review of Chapter 1 and 2, so don't fret. The economic model for goods and services resembles a table on page 50. So if you want to look at that real quick. So you have resources. It starts off at raw materials. Services would be individuals. With production, your manufacturing production facilities, and in the acquisition of knowledge and skills under services, and so on. So it's not too tough to follow there. And then a nice chart for looking at how the early stages of production goes through is page 53. And I'll let you actually just go and take a look at that. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it's a good visual. So all usable goods originally come from raw commodities in the earth, and services, of course, originally come from human labor. And this is the important point that I take from these two charts. So what determines labor? Is it labor? No. I mean, what determines value? Or reading, it's overrated. So what determines value? Is it labor? It is not labor. Individuals make choices on the basis of preferences and values, and therefore no amount of labor or production adds value to a product or service unless there is a significant final demand to warrant the cost. Values consists of subjective valuation of individual users. Final demand is the ultimate determining factor in what is produced at what price. And then an economic model is just simplified representations of the real world phenomena. So those charts you actually just look at were economic models. So economic models are not duplicates of the real world, but are heuristic, a process, and they involve simplifying assumptions. So the supply and demand curves are economic models. The production possibilities frontier we talked about in chapter 2, that's an economic model. The chart on page 53 you just looked at, those are economic models. And they all have assumptions. And as long as when those assumptions hold true, you get the same results. It's a good economic model or theory. Now, inventories exist at all stages of production. And the reason why this is actually important is because if inventories didn't exist at all those different stages of production, not only would we lose those efficiencies of having the product right there and being able to continue to produce goods and services, we also would create a much longer waiting period for consumers. And we'll get into this one a little bit deeper when we get into the idea of capital deepening near the end of the book. Of course, we already talked about cooperation. So cooperation exists at all stages of production, as it exists in all parts of the economy. We have common interests, so therefore we are trying to get through it and create that product or service, and we're all trying to make a profit in that common interest as well. Now, competition also exists at those different stages of production. So there's competition for the raw commodities that are going into it. There's competition between competitors producing the exact same thing. And then the end result is consumption and investment. So after we finally produce everything, the whole point of it is so we can get it to the end consumer, and then, or of course to another business, which would be your investment. Now, consumption does vary in length and does represent depreciation in value as it is consumed. So obviously you have different levels of consumption and speed. So when you eat food, it's gone. You've consumed it. But the consumption of, say, a house would take years and years and years. And depending on the quality of the building products that we use will completely change how long it takes before part of it is consumed up and you have to fix it or the whole thing deteriorates. Investment is the money that is returned to the production process. So you as a business aren't going to take all the money that you make and just keep it, unless you're closing your business, that is. You're going to end up returning a whole bunch of that money back to the productive process, back to your business, so that your business can continue to run. Then on page 66, we see that the production process adds value to the economy. So the production process is that downward curve coming towards the line that represents the increase in money, and consumption is going to be the opposite, that's pulling away. So we're producing those items for consumption, and then because the consumption is going to be using that up. But the production is adding the value, and the consumption is depreciating the value. So you can see the visual there. And obviously, in our economy, we actually have a situation where the production is greater than the consumption. So we're creating more value than we are consuming in the current economy. And that's it for chapter 3. So it's a short one. I do recommend continuing to go through it because there's some interesting points and examples and stuff that the chapter gives. But those are the important points, of course, that you are going to need for the test. So have a good one.